So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the morality of war. And the two thinkers that I have in mind that I want to look at here on this subject, one being from the Chinese tradition, another being from the Western tradition, although my selection of a Western thinker here is actually much later than the ancients, in that it's a medieval thinker, but this medieval thinker I think is saturated in ancient thought. And I think, therefore, there's a tethering or an anchoring back to ancient thought there that's worth noting. And these two thinkers are going to be, in the Chinese tradition, it's going to be Mozi, and in the Western tradition, we'll take a look at Thomas Aquinas. And the works there from Mozi, like many of the authors we've encountered, sometimes the totality of their works that are edited together share the name of the author. So the collected works of Mozi are called the Mozi. The collected works of Mengzi are the Mengzi. And the collected works of Zhuangzi are the Zhuangzi, and so on. And so in that book, the Mozi, there is a smaller piece called the Condemnation against Offensive War. So we're going to take a look at that, because this is very much, we think of, some people look at the, the classic of Sun Tzu's, the Art of War, as that's the classic go-to, stuff like, stuff that's been kind of watered down to some degree, but, know your enemy better than you know yourself, stuff like that. Interesting work. But of course, it talks about almost the kind of elegance and virtue in that work of Sun Tzu, of conducting warfare in a masterful way. Mozi is not about that at all. He's not a fan of warfare, or really violence for that matter. He's entirely opposed to it. And I want to get at why, before we get into his specific argument against warfare, I think we should see where Mozi is coming from, as we've done with some of our other thinkers too. Like, look at their backgrounds, where are they coming from, why do they make the claims that they do, as we've done with many others. So the first thing you should know about Mozi is, relatively speaking, he is entirely in opposition to Confucianism. Now, I hesitate to say Kongzi himself, all right, but that system that came out of Kongzi's teaching, of the Zhangming, that there's these basic relationships that we ought to find where they are, find where our roles are, and just do those roles. So if I'm a son, I need to exhibit filial piety to the best of my ability. So I just need to check off the things on the list. And Kongzi, of course, and we see this in the Analects, says, yeah, you do that, but and also in the Doctrine of the Mean, the Great Learning, basically you do those things in conjunction with other aspects, acting in certain ways, performing the right things at the right time for the right reasons, having a certain dignity and elegance really in all things, from the most celestial to the most mundane. Whatever it is, do the right thing there, right? And that, because if you don't do that, that's what caused the destruction of those dynasties in the mythic past. Of course, I'm sure Kongzi wouldn't think of it as mythic. Well, like I said, Kongzi says this. It's a whole system, really, of thought, of all these things interworking together. It seems to be the case that some Confucians that came later made the practice here something where, all right, what it means is I just need to accomplish the things on the list. All right, I need to be a good son. Did I get something from my dad today? Did I say thank you, Dad, or something like that? It becomes kind of analogous, I think, in some degree, to the gospel criticisms of Jesus of Nazareth against the ruling authorities at the time, or the ruling, like the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, and so on. Oh, you're saying you've reduced the actual system down to things that you can just check off and say, oh, I did this. I don't need to worry about anything else anymore. And it's not really internalized. Remember, for Kongsi, it's not just that you exhibit filial piety. It's that shouldn't be something that you really even have to activate. It should already be there. That's what really the virtuous society looks like. You shouldn't have to go, oh yeah, well, I guess I'm gonna have to, be pious towards my parents. No. It should that desire shouldn't have to be activated or coaxed. It should already be there. That's what Kongsi taught. But it seems like some others came along later and had kind of, reduced it down to it. Why do I say it seems like it? Because Mozi is very evidently, and he's probably doing what he's doing a little bit after Kongsi, and Lao Tzu for that matter. But this notion of just, checking things off the list, like, oh, well, I've got obligations to my father, my parents, my siblings, the elders of my community, my king, okay, my children, if I've got them. If they're not on the list, I don't really owe them anything. And that's sort of a watered down, lazy Confucianism. And this is what it seems to me that Mozi is opposing. Because Mozi says we shouldn't really have a Zhang Ming. There's not a rectification of names. If anything, we should have a rectification of our relationships with every individual, but it shouldn't be put in some sort of hierarchical system. Now, in order to demonstrate this point, what I want to do is I want to look at, before we get to war, and this will lead into our conversation about war, Mozi has a particular way that he says we ought to be treating people in the first place, and so that's going to dictate how we approach the subject of war and the necessity of violence and things like that. We can't come to we can't come to why warfare is right or wrong. I'm going to go into Mozi is going to be opposed to it. If the title that I mentioned earlier, Condemnation of Offensive War, didn't give it away. Okay, he's going to be opposed to, especially conquesting violence. There might be a sense, I think, in which Mozi would approve of violence for the sake of defense. Okay, self-defense. Okay, I think he would approve of that with restraint. Okay, but certainly offensive war, he's opposed to it because of the way that he views humanity and morality. And so I'll go ahead and say here, that is not in the Confucian way. Or at least what's purported to be the Confucian way. So that whole Zhang Ming, that list of names. Okay, well, all right, I got to figure out how I treat my father. I got to figure out how I treat my sons. I got to figure out how I treat my spouse. I got to figure out how I treat my king. And how do I treat people not on the list? Now, to be fair, Kongsi himself said exactly what to do. You should treat everybody with a certain dignity. Okay, Kongsi said that very clearly in the Analects. But it seems that this, lackadaisical version of Confucianism that persists for some reason, Mozi is opposed to this. Okay, so his first challenge comes up in the collection of the Mozi in the section, chapter 16, Impartial Caring, which immediately precedes what we're going to look at on war. I think there's a reason for that. This comes right before his talk of warfare. And so let's take a look at chapter 16 first. Now, chapter 16, in the second edition, it's on page 68. In the first edition, it's on page 63 of our book here, where we find Mozi, Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy. So let's go ahead and take a look at chapter 16 therein, and I'll do a little bit of analysis there, and then we'll move on to chapter 17, where he specifically talks about the notion of warfare. All right, so let's start here by looking at, this is again chapter 16 of the Mozi, the notion of impartial caring. Like I said, in the second edition, this is on page 68. Right, the beginning here. Our teacher Mozi says, the business of a benevolent person is to promote what is beneficial to the world and eliminate what is harmful. So notice this is the clause here that I really want to emphasize. This is not relegated to one's father, to one's king, to one's spouse, to the elders or youth of the community, to one's children. To whom are we to be benevolent? Now, constantly stressed constantly. Fathers, you're supposed to be pious to your father. That's really almost the most holy thing that you could do. Mozi says here, what we want to really promote is what's beneficial to the world directly. Now, Kongsi said, if all children are pious to their own fathers, exhibit that filial piety, that will in effect make the world a better place. Mozi is saying here that really our direct duty is to the world itself and to eliminate what is harmful. It continues, granted that this is true, what are the greatest harms that are being done in the world today? Our teacher Mozi says, it is things such as great states attacking small states. That's offensive war. We'll come to that more clearly in the next chapter. Great families wreaking havoc with lesser families, the strong robbing the weak, the many doing violence to the few, the clever deceiving the ignorant, and the noble acting arrogantly toward the humble. These are some of the great harms being done in the world. In addition, there are rulers who are not kind, ministers who are not loyal, fathers who are not loving, and children who are not filial. All those things that Kongs has said that ought to be, they're not there. These too are some of the great harms being done in the world. There are those of low character who use weapons, poison, water, and fire to injure and steal from one another. These too are some of the great harms done in the world. If we try to discover the origin of these different harms, where do we find that they come from? Do they come from caring for and benefiting people? This clearly must be rejected as the origin of these harms. We must recognize that they come from hating and stealing from people. If we wish to distinguish those in the world who hate and steal from people, do we refer to them as impartial or partial? We clearly must call them partial. And so it is to those who are partial in their dealings with others who are the real cause of all the great harms in the world. This is why our teacher Mozi says, I condemn partiality. So let me stop here for a moment. Notion of partiality here. Here's the short claim. I condemn partiality. So what does that mean here? This condemnation of partiality. What does it mean to be partial? I have like a bias to say, all right, I'm going to value you over something else. Okay, you have maybe some sort of interest of some kind in one party, hence the partiality over another. Fine. I condemn partiality. In what sense? Well, the popular Confucianism of the time is itself partiality. Who should you treat best? Fathers. Kings. The elders. Now, of course, there were virtues in the downward relation towards the youth, towards the wife, at least in the Confucian construction, which is inherently patriarchal at the time. All right, towards the subjects from the ruler, and so on. All right, towards the children from the father. This partiality means that those various relationships where one is to be valued over the other, and then we can think of people that aren't on the list. All right, you're not my dad, you're not my child, you're not my spouse, you're not part of the elders or youth of my community, you're not my sibling. What do I owe you exactly? Nothing, because you're not on the list. Mozi says here, I condemn partiality. What that means is we really shouldn't have a view of hierarchies of people. Some people are more valuable than others. He condemns that. Now, and then he says, now, if you're going to condemn something, I like this. I think this is good advice too. Now, those who condemn another's view must offer something in its place. If you're going to criticize something, offer some kind of solution or replacement. If one condemns another view without offering something in its place, it's like adding water to a flood or flame to a fire. Such appeals have no merit. So, what am I saying do instead? That is why our teacher, Mozi, says replace partiality with impartiality. Okay, great. That's the replacement. What does that look like? If we have this notion of partiality, well, impartiality obviously means not partiality. But what does that entail? Our teacher Mozi says, if people regarded other people's states in the same way that they regard their own, who then would incite their own state to attack that of another? For one would do for others as one would do for oneself. Now, this is a moral teaching that shows up in a lot of places. I think we see it, something very similar in the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. I think we see something very similar in the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. This is at least earlier than Jesus, if not earlier than the Buddha. There's some dispute of when the Buddha lived. So this is at least 2,500 years ago, here where we are with Mozi. So listen, what he said there, like, you wouldn't steal from yourself, would you? And you wouldn't want yourself to be stolen from. So regard other people's stuff as you would regard your own. Mozi. If people regarded other people's cities in the same way that they regard their own, who then would incite their own city to attack that of another? For one would do for others as one would do for oneself. There it is very clearly. Right? If people regarded other people's families in the same way that they regard their own, who then would incite their own family to attack that of another? For one would do for others as one would do for oneself. And he keeps going up. And so if states and cities do not attack one another and families do not wreak havoc upon and steal from one another, would this be a harm to the world or a benefit? So he's like, this thing I'm describing here, where you realize, oh, well, let's our family treat other families like we would, like ourselves. Like we wouldn't rob ourselves. Let's treat our own city. Let's treat the cities of others like our own city. Well, we wouldn't want this to happen in our city, so let's not do it to them. Your own state, like going up even higher. You wouldn't want this to happen to your own country, so why would you wish it on another? Stop right there. And then he says, like, so would that be better or worse? And he says, of course, it's obvious that things would be more beneficial in that scenario. Then he goes on to ask this question. Well, okay, if we try and discover the source of these different benefits, where do we say they come from? Do they come from hating and stealing? All right, the good things in the world. Does it come from hating and stealing? No. We clearly must reject this. No. If we wish to distinguish those in the world who care for and benefit people, do we refer to them as impartial or partial? We must clearly call them impartial. And so it is, those who are impartial in their dealings with others, who are the real cause of all the great benefits in the world. Here he said it. All the great things that we can imagine, it comes from impartiality, like in human relations. It comes from impartiality and versus partiality. So let's again explain the difference. Partiality, treating others in certain ways with certain kinds of values. Now you can think of this in the kind of pseudo-Confucian system. All right, like, oh, fathers are more valuable than anybody else in the family. Okay, kings are more valuable than anyone else in the country. Husbands are more valuable than wives, and so on. Like you could do it this way. Okay, elder siblings are more valuable than younger siblings in this scheme. But also we can take this in other ways. Do we not do this in our societies? People that make more money are more valuable than poor people. Have we not done it throughout history? Okay, certain genders are more valuable than others. Certain skin tones are more valuable than others. Anytime we say one group or one thing, one aspect makes someone more valuable than another, that is partiality, period. And Mozi has just told us 2,500 years ago, anytime that shows up, nothing good comes from it. Okay, it's the cause of stealing and terrible things, violence. It comes from partiality. All the good in the world, It comes from people saying, I'm not going to treat people differently. That's impartiality. I'm going to treat people. There is no partiality. There's not these people and those people. I'm going to treat everybody the same. Impartially. Now, this is not to say that we can't recognize differences. This is why he's not talking about equality. Equality is more of a modern notion, right? So in impartiality, it might even be like, okay, this person's taller than this person's shorter. They're different. All right, I can acknowledge the differences. Okay, great, we're different. Impartiality says, in spite of those differences, I'm still going to treat everybody the same. That's impartiality. Okay, and that's why we use that term instead of equality. Again, the notion of equality becomes a more modern notion and has a little bit different nuance to it. For all practical purposes, they're basically the same, but I think we could make some nuanced differences. But he continues, top of the next page in the first edition. This is why our teacher Mozi says, I approve of impartiality. Moreover, earlier I said that the business of a benevolent person is to promote what is beneficial to the world and eliminate what is harmful. And now I have shown that impartiality gives rise to all the great benefits in the world, and that partiality gives rise to all the great harms in the world. It's really difficult to not be clearer than this. And in fact, whereas what we could call that Confucian series of relationships, the Zhang Ming, the rectification of names, and say that's kind of at least one of the cores of Confucian thought, even if it's not all of what Conqueror himself said. One of the central aspects, if not the most central aspect of Mozi's thought, is what we're talking about here, this notion of impartiality. So in the text, we have this term or this concept that you might see come up, and this is the notion of jian'ai. Jian'ai, which in English would be something like, I've seen it translated as indiscriminate love, or impartial love, impartial caring. Take your pick. I think I like the idea. Sometimes universal love. I'm I'm partial to the notion of indiscriminate. I like the idea it's love that does not discriminate. You don't say, nope, you're not allowed any of this. And so there's a sense in which, whereas in that version of the Zhang Ming, all right, oh, what do I owe my dad? Let me look up on the list. All right, let me look at the chart, rectification of names, there it is. Right, let's see, you're my dad, I owe you filial piety. All right, that way that you would treat your father with a certain kind of dignity and respect, don't just present that to your father, Mozi would say. Treat everyone with that same kind of dignity. Your mother, your father, your king, your friends, strangers even. Treat everyone with that kind of dignity. Okay? Treat other people's children the way you would treat your own children. In fact, treat other adults with the same kind of gentility and kindness that you would show, or that you ought to show, towards your own children. Treat everybody with impartiality and extend it outward. Don't just keep it at, well, and if that's the case, then I'm going to treat everybody equally by hating everyone. Okay? No. Because the concept of benevolence is sealed into the concept. Okay? Mozi is very much about what we're doing here. This is to benefit everyone, not just a few. That's why it's impartiality for everyone. It's not just impartiality for its own sake. It's for the sake of being beneficial for humankind. And really, there's already a universal, not just humankind, not just people in China, but for humankind. He really talks about it in cosmic terms of the world, limited as though he might have a sense of his field of view of the world at the time. He nevertheless looks at it in that way. Okay, we can all do this together, like if people just thought about things differently. So it's not talking about completely restructuring the mechanisms of the world, but a restructuring of the way that we think about our relationships. So that's the starting point for Mozi. Well, so if he's all about impartiality, then of course, what is this going to entail about warfare? Especially aggressive warfare, conquering warfare, imperial, colonizing warfare, conquistadores, and so on. obviously he has no notion of conquistadores because they're not. Spain doesn't exist yet. Okay, no España yet. But nevertheless, this idea of conquest, from which we get the Spanish conquistador. What do you think about this? Well, he tells us. This is in the next chapter on the notion of offensive war, precisely his problem with it. And it's not merely, the problem is not merely that, well, if you go back and look at what I said before, obviously we need to treat everybody impartially, so that would be a violation of that. Obviously, that follows. But he actually has a more nuanced argument where he tries to almost make a very obvious intuition for us about warfare. And it's in the same style of reasoning that he's already done, where he truly, really, he does this in a very, it reminds me of Socrates, but Socrates comes later, actually. All right? So this thing where let me make you figure it out. You already know the answer. I'm just going to kind of guide you on your quest to get there. He kind of does that in the reasoning that we see in the next chapter as well. Okay, so let's go ahead now and jump to the next chapter, chapter 17. All right, so chapter 17. A condemnation of aggressive war. Let's get right into the argument. Our teacher Mozi says, again, this, by the way, is in the first edition on page 72, in the second edition on page 77. Our teacher Mozi says, now, suppose someone enters another's orchard and steals their peaches and plums. Okay, we already know that should be bad, right? Based on what we said before. We get that verb in there, steal. Someone comes in and steals someone else's stuff. Now, when people hear this, they will condemn such a person as a thief. And if those above who administer the government get hold of them, they will punish them. Why? Because he takes from others in order to benefit himself. Stealing another's dogs, hogs, chickens, and pigs is even more wrong than entering another's orchard and stealing their peaches and plums. Why? Because more is taken from others. It is even more inhumane and a more serious crime. Okay, so he's saying here, you steal a little bit, like peaches and plums. Okay, that's fruit, it's going to grow back. Okay, stealing a little bit, wrong. We punish it. Stealing dogs, hogs, chickens, and pigs. Are those things replaceable in a certain sense, but not in the same way. Okay, pigs don't grow on trees. Okay, they're not going to come back. That's more wrong. Because it's a more serious crime. Entering another person's stable and stealing their horses and cattle is even more wrong than stealing their dogs, hogs, chickens, and pigs. Why? Because more is taken from others. Those are more substantive. All right, you use a horse at a time for travel. Right? Cattle sometimes for labor, in addition for substantial meat as well. Also for hauling. I mean, this is what he's saying here is there are things obviously that are more valuable to have for use. There's a certain sense in that it's more wrong to steal a car than it is to steal a piece of gum, and that's why those are punished with different levels of severity. Okay, shoplifting is different from grand theft auto. Right? Now they're both in terms of kind, they're the same type of crime. But obviously, we can talk about severity, not even by intent. All right, maybe the shoplifter is there's more of an intentionality. Like, I'm going to steal this gum, and they mean it even more malevolently than the person who's like, I need to steal a car because I need to make money. Like, I've got to do it to take care of my. Maybe there's a different notion of intent going on there. That's kind of irrelevant, though. We can talk about the severity of the crime when it comes to stealing in terms of what has been stolen. So he says this is an even more inhumane and more serious crime. You grant that, right? He's like, yeah, we get you get that idea of scale, right? Yeah, this is worse than this, and this is worse than this. Okay, stealing some things is worse than stealing others. There is partiality, all right, in crime, all right, in severity of misdeeds and wrongs. On the other hand, now, all right, you've got that down with the stealing. Now he keeps going. Killing an innocent person, stripping him of clothes, taking his spear and sword is even more wrong than entering his stable and stealing his horse and cattle. Why? Because more is taken from others. All right, you add on top of this now, taking all their stuff and killing someone. Obviously, that's worse. Because more is taken. You took their life. Up to this point, so this is what he says. Up to this point, all the gentlemen, Junzi, of the world know well enough to condemn such actions and declare that they are wrong. So, what he's saying here is like everything I've mentioned so far, everybody up to here, up to this point, would go, yep, I agree with that. On a fundamental level. All those things are obvious. Yes, those things are wrong. Do they happen? Yes. And even when they do happen, everybody would condemn them. Sure. And he said, he doesn't just say anybody, but especially wise people, the Junzi, would do such a thing. The gentlemen. But for some reason, when it comes to the great wrong of attacking another state, another country, going to war, they do not know enough to condemn it. Rather, they praise this and declare that it's the right thing to do. Can such people be said to understand the difference between right and wrong? So I want you to follow the trajectory here, at least so far. What is the trajectory of the argument here? The trajectory is already have these little instances of stealing plums, to stealing dogs and hogs, to stealing horses, to killing someone and taking all their stuff, to now going to war to another country. And what he's saying is these are, as you go up the scale, these things actually get worse and worse and worse, with war at the top, war with another state being the worst of these scenarios. But if war is the worst of these scenarios, then why is it that, it seems like the state will go out of its way to punish petty crimes, often severely. Alright, stealing? Alright, well, we'll throw you in jail for a while. You might, depending on what you steal, alright, the severity of it, you might, have limbs cut off or be executed or something. Whatever it may be, there might be severe punishments for it. Why is it, though, like, we get that that's wrong. We get that murder is wrong. The state will step in, you're a murderer, you're going to be hanged yourself. Okay, there will be some sort of recompense for your murdering. And so we go, oh, those things are bad. We even go, that person, we even, denigrate, that person's a thief. That person's a murderer. We don't say, that person's a conqueror? In fact, we have I can think of a couple of heroes throughout history where we put the moniker of the Conqueror after their name. And they're praised in some respect. Sometimes they don't have the moniker. I'm thinking of Guillaume, or William the Conqueror, the first Norman King of England. All right, William the Conqueror. What do you do? Yeah, he killed some people in war. All right. In fact, all of a sudden now the kings of England are French. 1066. Chinggis, Temujin, Genghis Khan, conquering huge swath of the world. Not in benevolence, not in loving kindness and mercy, but through bloodshed. The conquistadores that I mentioned earlier, when Spain goes into Central, South, and even parts of North America, and the Caribbean. Okay, I'm thinking Cortez, Pizarro come to mind. These conquistadores, literally the conquerors, going and taking, right, these lands and these taking from these people in the name of post 1492, in the name of España, but also later in the name of France, in the name of England as well, and also Portugal, right, amongst others. Later, I mean, colonies pop up, even like in the 19th century, European powers that don't have any colonies start deciding that they want to have colonies and try and figure out, well, what's left that I can colonize? Okay, like the Belgians in parts of, I want to say Cameroon, all right, or the Germans in parts of Africa as well. So trying to find little places that are left. Everybody's got to have some place that they can conquer and exploit. And it goes back, this is back throughout history, the notion of conquest. We're not talking about wars for self-defense. We're not talking about we've been invaded, we have to get rid of the invaders. We're talking about, I want that. So I'm going to kill people because I want it. And it might be different reasons for conquest. It might be, I want their gold. It might be, I want their oil. It might be I want some other natural resource that they have. It might be that I want more hegemony in the area. What does that mean? Like, I might want these people to be the same religion that I have in my domain, so that I can expect no hostility from there. So often when you have different religious beliefs, like with the fracturing of various, where we get denominations of Christianity in Europe as a result of the Protestant Reformations, what starts to happen is, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, people, Holy Roman emperors start getting nervous. Okay, well now, Bohemia's got a bunch of Protestants, and they, who knows what they might do at any moment. And we've got Catholics down here in Österreich. All right, so that's good. But what if the Lutherans decide to do something over here, or the Catholics over here? And what now? England has decided to make its own form of Protestantism right across the sea from France, and also divorcing King Henry VIII, divorcing his Spanish wife. Like, all right, this is making us nervous. So sometimes 1588, Spanish Armada goes in to try and invade England. Why? To Catholicize it. Why? Because it's not for gold, but for a notion of stability. All right, knowing that there's not going to be some sort of hostile element here. See this in the 20th century. The Cold War, dividing the world basically, post-World War II, dividing the world into basically two camps. The First World, okay, the Western developed countries. The Second World, we don't talk about that one much. It's the communist countries, Soviet bloc. And then what's the Third World? What's up for grabs? Yeah, they're poor because they're not as awesome as the first two. I mean, that's the sentiment. I'm not endorsing that sentiment. In fact, I'm quite critical of calling countries third world countries, saying, well, you're not America and you're not the Soviet Union, so you're just whatever's left. But definitely there's a sense in which these areas need to be conquered by the two prevailing powers and their proxies and so on. So this is what the kind of thing that Mozi is condemning. He's condemning the aggressive war where violence is used not to protect, but to capture. The rapacious kind of war, again, rapacious from that Latin rapere, to take. It's related to the English word rape, right? To take, right? In a malevolent sense, right? When I say rapacious, okay, not in the sense of enrapturing or rapture, but rapacious in the sense of taking, like a raptor taking its prey. So that's at the top of the list of really human crimes. So Mozi's not playing around here. He's not saying war is one of many evils among others. It is, but it's also worse than the others. It's much more severe than simply stealing plums. It's not the same thing. Warfare is much worse than stealing plums, but it's also worse than murder. We don't think of killing in combat as murder, do we? So when we talk about the notion of killing, we often make distinctions. Okay? We talk about various justifications for the death of a human being by a human being. What are some of the ways that we kill others? Executions. The death penalty. Whether it be a headsman's axe, someone flipping the switch on an electric chair, or someone with a syringe doling out a lethal injection. Here we are killing another human being, but that seems like it's justified. Is it murder? Some would think so, some would disagree. Killing someone in self-defense. Someone's coming into your home. They're a threat to you. They're threatening to you. Is killing them murder, or is it self-defense? It might be justified. What if they come into your home, they're trying to steal your stuff, but now they're running away and you decide to shoot them in the back? And they're unarmed. Is it murder? Or is it self-defense? Is it right? What if it's the police suspecting that someone has a weapon and they're holding a toy? Is that justified? Some people think so. Some people not. We have all these ways of killing others, so we make these distinctions. Well, it seems to be nuanced. We have various laws to mitigate it, and some are more common. So, like in the United States, we have degrees of murder. Okay, you know, the most severe, first-degree murder. I killed someone, and I was planning to do it for a while. Okay, that one's really bad. Now there, it's bad because of the intent. Second-degree murder. It's not as bad. The result is still the same. You killed somebody else. What's the difference? Well, I hadn't really been planning on it. It just kind of happened. I came in. I realized that this person had done something. Like, oh, you know, my significant other was cheating on me. I came home, caught them cheating. You know, I killed them both. It wasn't something I was planning. It just kind of happened. Okay. End result is still the same. Someone killed somebody else. Then we can talk about manslaughter. It was a complete accident. You know, I was operating a forklift. I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing. And I ended up injuring someone else to the point that they died. Okay. No intent of actually harming another person at all. Okay. Now, it happened through neglect and through incompetence, but not through any kind of active malevolence or even volition of any kind. It just sort of happened. One thing led to another. Those distinctions, like, the end result is you killed somebody else. They're all wrong, but we could talk about different notions of severities. But we'd all agree that the killing someone else, there's a certain kind, murder. We'd all agree, that one. Like, going at, especially that first-degree murder. Few are going to disagree that that's wrong. Unless you yourself are a sociopath. But we would at least say for society, that one's wrong. We might make distinctions with some others. No one's going to disagree with that. Just killing someone just to take their stuff, that's wrong. What Mozi is saying here is, yeah, but that's what war is. And it's usually not just one other person. You're killing a bunch of other people to take their stuff. How could that possibly be morally praiseworthy? Let's take a look at the next part of his argument. He's already said that warfare is on the top of that list. Aggressive war is already on the top of that list of wrong things. It's really, really bad. Okay? He's not going to talk about being a necessary evil like some might do. He's saying it's wrong, period. Let's move forward. So, obviously, when we're talking about murder, you know, killing someone is wrong and must be punished with execution. Okay, we might disagree in terms of the appropriate punishment there, but that seems to be. We understand that murder needs to be punished. Now, I'm not going to make the argument that it need to be, but that's taken as kind of a given. Murder is something that we punish. We think of it as wrong. But if we extrapolate out from this view, so I love it when Mozi does this. He says, all right, take this as a given. Now zoom out. But if we extrapolate from this view, then killing 10 people is 10 times as bad. It must be punished with 10 executions. Because of the severity. Like, if killing someone in murder, let me be clear there. If murdering someone warrants the death penalty, surely murdering 10 people in a certain way kind of warrants 10 death penalties. And killing 100 people, he goes on. Killing 100 people would be like 100 death penalties worth of crime. Okay? And if you, in terms of its badness, obviously you can't. It doesn't seem to be the case that you know, if one person killed 10 people, it's not like you can, you know, execute them, resurrect them, execute them, resurrect them, execute them, resurrect them. But we can say that at least what they deserve is 10 executions worth of punishment. All right, even if we lack the ability to divvy it out, that seems to be at least what is merited there. If it follows that the punishment for murder is execution by the state. So, and he says here, everybody would agree on this point. Yeah, like you do that, that's kind of what you deserve, really. If you kill 100 people, you're like, obviously, someone who murders 100 people is a worse murderer than someone who murders one person. It's more severe of a crime. It's not just numerically more impressive. It's more severe of being a crime, of being morally abhorrent. But, says Mozi, when it comes to the great wrong of attacking another state, they do not know enough to condemn it. Rather, they praise this and declare that it's the right thing to do. So people are all of a sudden like, murder is bad, killing hundreds of other people is bad. But when you're sending your troops to go attack the next city over, to attack a country of other people, all of a sudden, now it's fine all of a sudden. Why? He says rather people praise it. Yeah! Let's get them. Let's kill the enemy. They cheer. Rather, they praise this and declare that it's the right thing to do. They really do not understand that this is wrong. That is why they record their praise of such activity and hand down these records to later generations. If they really understood that this is wrong, why would they record their wrongs and hand them down to later generations? No, warfares are a sense of pride. Consider just the United States alone. We almost divide our eras of history by the wars that we've had. Not that every single war of the United States has been the case where the United States is the aggressor. But think about this for a moment. So I want you to let's take the United States as an example. And let me say this here. My purpose is not to denigrate the United States here. All right, that is not my purpose or function. But let's consider the engagements and the aggression of the United States here, just as a historical example. We could pick many more examples throughout history, whether we're talking about the horde of the Golden Khanate, all right, the Abbasid Caliphate, all right, the Ottoman Empire, all right, whatever you want. All right, we can think of, there are tons of examples throughout history, but since the United States is probably the most familiar in one's historical memory, I would imagine, let's go with this. Okay, let's just examine this for a moment as an example and think about how really the way we carve up our history is with words that really we either know or don't. Let's take a brief look, a little excursus here at this. So consider how we divide the history of the United States up into really various wars. I mean, yeah, sure, there's various, we can talk about various movements, we can divide things up into decades, you know, we can talk about the 1870s, we can talk about the 1870s or the 1960s or something like that. But we really break things up in terms of wars and really identify with the eras. So, you know, there's the Revolutionary War era. That's America Begins! Right, that's the origin story of the United States. And actually, you could go back in colonial times before that, and really, it's if you want to talk about the area that becomes the United States, we could go back to the 1600s, all right, and really up until 1776, it's a history of colonial wars with American Indians and Indigenous peoples, with the English and the French, and later the American colonists, and then the American citizens themselves. So there's that era. So that's one of the big ones. We can talk about the I think the next big one, the War of 1812, War with England. I think the early 19th century. We can talk about the Mexican War. Okay, we don't talk about that one as much, but that's how we got a bunch of states in the South, West. Okay, the American Civil War. America's fighting itself. It's an era unto its own. The Spanish-American War. That's how the United States got places like Puerto Rico. Okay, Cuba for a time. This is way before Batista and later Castro. Okay. World War I. World War II. Those were defensive wars. Okay, we were provoked. I wasn't there. Korea, Vietnam. Those are results of the Truman Doctrine, right? To contain the spread of communism following World War II. Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq again. The latter two of which are still going on. In fact, for most of the people in this class, those wars have been going on your entire lifetime. You have actually not known a single breath without there being war of some kind. Now, one might immediately object here. Okay, wait a minute. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they're technically not wars because only Congress has the power to declare war, and it hasn't. I agree with you, sure. But if you want to go that route, using that logic, that it's only a war in United States history when the Congress declares war, then there have been precious few wars. The American Revolution doesn't count. There is no Congress. The Civil War doesn't count because there's no Congress declaring war on anybody there. And then Korea, Vietnam don't count either. So that leaves you with the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, that's it. If you want to go with, it's only war when Congress declares it, not when there's some sort of military action. But there's a bunch of, but we have, those are the eras. Okay? We could define now as part of the Afghanistan-Iraq era. It's lurking in the background. We could talk about, what's in tandem with the civil rights movement. There's so much of the anti-war movement of Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. Those things go together. There's something about the patriotism of the early 20th century that lines up with World War I and II. We kind of define ourselves by our wars. And that's why there is that great patriotism in the early 20th century, because the United States won those wars. Not alone, but that's at least the view that was held. We did it. We saved the world. In Vietnam, was there a win? Didn't seem like it. And so there became this almost malaise that followed 1975 and the fall of Saigon, where Americans were wondering, are we the baddies? Are we the good guys? And so, and you had different camps of, yeah, yes we are, and no we're not. And I think that notion persists to this day. I think with the point that we have wars going on, which we almost forget that they're happening. I think that really describes the 21st century, for which the only year in the 21st century the United States has not been deploying troops on somebody, maybe the year 2000? And there might be a counterexample to that. But there's not just those big wars, there's other ones that we don't talk about. Okay, there's the wars with the American Indigenous Indians. Well, and sometimes people don't, like, you know, say like Little Bighorn or something like that. Various wars against American Indians. A whole century of that. I mean, they're from the beginning until up to really the late 19th century. It's almost over 100 years from the beginning. Okay, we've got the hymn of the Marine Corps has the line, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Both of those are talking about American conquest. Both of those lines. Well, halls of Montezuma, where's that? Mexico. The song is celebrating the Marines went into Mexico. Why? James K. Polk kind of wanted to. Okay. There was some stuff that had to do with Texas. I don't want to get into it, but we have conquest. Also, this one's not as well known. Under Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and I think also under James Madison, the Barbary Wars. I don't remember even studying this really in high school. What happened? Now, there were pirates in the Mediterranean, in the North Atlantic, also the Caribbean. Their bases originating in North Africa, Tripoli. And the Marines, Thomas Jefferson sent Marines over there. You're going to have a mission. You're going to take over North Africa. You're going to stop the pirates, and we're going to keep some bases there in the Mediterranean. That's going to happen. That's how the United States started really getting a lot of its overseas assets. Like, you might think about it. You know, think how many bases the United States has all over the world. Some of that happened during World War II, but a lot of them happened earlier, like here. We're going to go into North Africa. We're going to stop these pirates. Now, there you could say it was provoked by piracy, sure, but it results with American troops invading North Africa in the early 1800s. Okay. Close to when the stuff with Napoleon is happening. America's still willing to go over there and do some stuff with that in North Africa, in northwestern North Africa. Napoleon himself would have been Egypt. So you have those Barbary Wars, various Seminole Wars. I mean, Florida exists as a state because Andrew Jackson decided to invade it to go after Seminoles, much to the chagrin of President John Quincy Adams. Okay, like, all right, you know, suppress the Seminoles in Georgia and South Carolina, hold them off, don't let them come up here. Andrew Jackson, who's on the $20 bill and later becomes the president himself, decides to invade Florida. Right, that's why, which was a Spanish colony. Remember, 13 colonies. Florida's not part of it. Okay. But because of the actions of Andrew Jackson, Florida ended up being, through treaty, basically the United States has to go to Spain saying, look, we're really sorry that we invaded your colony. We didn't really plan on it, but we've done it, so maybe we could have like a trade, and we'll pay for Florida if we can just have it. Because at the time, it was considered just a peninsular swamp, not much else. But yeah, that gets incorporated there. Okay. Various other wars. There's things that happen, military actions here that you might hear from the 80s and 90s. Stuff happening in Grenada. Something happening in Mogadishu. Okay, all over the place. Various military actions happening for the purposes of acquisition. Sometimes it's for self-defense, sometimes it's for acquisition, sometimes it's to manipulate various forms of, we'll say, regime maintenance, sometimes regime change. But there it is. But just think about how the history of America is saturated with war. And like I said, you really pick really any country. I think maybe not Switzerland, but so much of the modern countries of the world have been participating in war for centuries, decades, centuries, long time. It's such a normal thing in terms of its frequency. I don't mean normal in terms of its rightness or appropriateness, but in terms of its frequency. It happens all the time. It's very much a part of us. And Mozi is saying, why is it? And also, why is it something that we celebrate? Okay, now, I mentioned those wars against fascism, World War II. Okay. Wars against the imperialism of the Austrians and the Germans, all right, in World War I. Oh, all right, okay. The Germans had sunk the Lusitania. They were planning to help Mexico retake parts of the United States back. The United States is not going to stand for it. That's why the United States got in World War I, supposedly. But what about? Like I said, what about the celebrations that we have? Like, really, it simply seems like so much of who we are as a people. And I don't just mean the United States here, but I mean so many of the various cultures and societies on the planet. Who we are is really often a series of the wars that we've been in and the stuff that we've won. Mozi says, that can't be right. Now he continues, that is Mozi. Now suppose there is someone who does the following. When they see a little black, they say that it's black, but when they see a lot of black, they say that it's white. It sounds like something out of George Orwell's 1984. Oh, look, there's a little bit of, like, I take a black marker, and I draw a little black dot, and I go, yeah, that's black. And then I take a whole sheet of paper, and I color the entire thing with a black marker. And then I go, hey, look, that's white. We would just have to say that if someone did that, such a person cannot distinguish between black and white. They don't know what they're talking about. Or suppose when they say they taste a little bitterness, they say that it's bitter, but when they taste a lot of bitterness, they say, oh, it's sweet. Okay, bite into the most bitter thing you can. Oh, this is delicious. It's sweet. No, it's not. It's really bitter. Obviously, you don't know the difference between bitterness and sweetness. We'd have to say someone doesn't understand the distinction. But now people see a small wrong and know enough to condemn it. Stealing plums, that's wrong. But they see a great wrong, and they go, nope, that's right. It's good. Saying that something like stealing or murder is wrong, but war is right, is like pointing at a black dot and saying that it's black, but pointing at a big black dot and saying, or a whole black space and saying it's white. It's just as stupid and inconsistent. People really don't understand the distinction. Similarly, people don't really understand the distinction between good and evil if they say war, this kind of war at least, is good. And not just that, not just war, can they really be understood? Can we really say that they understand the difference between right and wrong if they make such an approbation that is they have an affirmation of this notion of offensive war? This is how we know that the gentlemen of the world are confused about the difference between right and wrong. They don't have it. They're wrong on this. They ought not celebrate this. And nevertheless, they do. So in summary then, what the argument against war here is that the problem with war is that it is obviously stealing. It is obviously murder in a maximal sense. We're going to kill a bunch of other people and take their stuff. That is what aggressive war is. That is what offensive war is. That is what imperialist war is. It is, we're going to go in, we're going to kill people and take their stuff. That's what it is. It's the same thing as stealing. It's the same thing as murder, just on a maximal level where it's endorsed by the state And sometimes we can script people into it. We say, all right, it's wrong for you to kill somebody else and take their stuff. Like your neighbor next door. Let's say you decide to kill them and take their house and their car. Maybe you spare their family. That's wrong. You do that, you're going to go to jail for murder, at least. But for some reason, when the government says, our neighbor that's a state, we're going to go in there and we're going to kill those people and we're going to take their stuff, all of a sudden, that's good and glorious and patriotic. How can it be? It's the same thing. It is stealing and it is murder, just exponentially increased in magnitude. That's all it is. All war is magnified murder, rape, pillaging, theft. How can that be right if when we tone it down and we have the murder of one person or the stealing of one thing, that is obviously wrong. Mozi is calling us to look at our inconsistencies here. So warfare is wrong because it is nothing but murder and thievery magnified. That's its wrongness lies in that. Now, in the history of Chinese thought, is Mozi celebrated? Not in his own day. Right after going on this sort of anti-war, indiscriminate love, anti-pseudo-Confucian crusade, Confucianism more or less becomes the default moral grounding of the Han Dynasty, which is about from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE. Okay, so there's that the China becomes, or what we could call China at the time, becomes very Confucianized. And so is there this celebration of Mozi? No. So the study of Mozi is often neglected, but here he tells us very, very simply, war is wrong, and it's wrong, and aggressive war is wrong, and ought to be avoided, because it's exactly what it looks like. It's stealing, and it's murder, but we justify it for some reason, and Mozi wants to demonstrate to us how irrational justifications for war are. When we say, no, it's good when the state tells us to murder other people. That's fine. Killing somebody in combat, in an aggressive war, totally fine. But if you as an individual decide to kill your neighbor in an aggressive and hostile takeover to acquire their things, that's obviously wrong. Why the disconnect? And the disconnect demonstrates a kind of inconsistency and an irrationality. So here, in a certain way, Mozi is telling us that aggressive war is not only wrong, but it's obviously irrational. I think it's a pretty good introduction to Mozi's view on war here. What we're going to do next time is we'll take a look at the views of Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas, not an ancient thinker, like I said earlier, but nevertheless he is saturated in ancient thought, and so I think while he's a medieval thinker, in fact, 1225 to 1274 is when he lived entirely in the 13th century. Almost made it to 50 years old, did not. Prolific writer. He has some things to say about war as well, and it's different. Of course, he's living in the Middle Ages in Europe. War is all over the place. Okay, but he has a very different take on war, but some of the things that Thomas Aquinas said about war in the Middle Ages actually mitigate some of the ways and some of the restraints that we see on warfare in the 20th century. Obviously, in the 13th century and following as well, throughout really the last 800 years. But we really see these things come into play in the 20th century that are very Thomistic in origin. So we'll talk about that. The notion of the just war.